Most people agree that personal finance should be taught in school, with some surveys showing that as much as 9 in 10 Americans believe it should be taught. Another survey shows that at least 60% of Americans think that it should be taught in school. So it's pretty safe to say that at least 50% of Americans believe it should be taught in school. So the question is, why isn't it taught? In today's video, I wanted to go into depth as far as some of the issues surrounding teaching personal finance, because it may seem as easy as just, everybody agrees to teach personal finance, and so it should be done, right? But it's not necessarily as easy. So I'm going to go into some of the data revolving financial literacy, talk about some of the issues revolving teaching personal finance as far as who's going to be teaching it, how should we approach it. But first, if you wouldn't mind hitting that like button to show appreciation for the amount of research and time I spent into this video, I would appreciate it a lot. So first, to make the case on why personal finance should be taught, most people cite a lack of financial knowledge as the main reason why they're lacking opportunity or lacking financial opportunities in their own life. And so if you think about it this way, people in their 20s, they're making these huge important financial decisions. They're getting their first car, getting their first apartment, possibly opening up their first credit card. Those are huge financial decisions. But, if you're in your 20s, you may not necessarily have any financial knowledge or know-how on the best way to navigate those decisions. So what ends up happening? You end up overpaying for a car. You may make a late payment on your credit card, hurting your credit score, or you may have to, leave your apartment early and then lose your deposit on that apartment. These are costly mistakes that you can end up paying thousands of dollars, down the road, and it takes years to recover from some of these, bad, poor financial decisions. And I don't necessarily blame people for, making these poor financial decisions in their 20s or even younger or even in their 30s and 40s. Because if you think about it, if no one's taught you these financial skills, and on top of that, everybody in these different industries has an incentive to push you further as far as, making these bad financial decisions. For example, a car salesman may end up selling you a more expensive car, and that's, in their best financial interest, but it's not necessarily in the best financial interest for somebody who's in their 20s and doesn't have the financial knowledge. And the final point on all of this is, if you're under the burden of debt and you have thousands of dollars that you owe, or maybe you have bad credit, these things end up causing you to lose opportunities, right? You may be so stressed about money and finances that, it affects your personal relationships, it affects your job performance, so it really has huge lasting impacts. Okay, so it's pretty safe to say that people would benefit from personal finance being taught in school, but there's still this question on who's going to teach personal finance and when is the best time to teach personal finance to an individual. Take a look at this breakdown of a survey of when personal finance should be taught. It's pretty much split evenly with the exception of college, and these are all people that agree that personal finance should be taught. You see, on the one hand, if personal finance is taught too early, it may actually de-incentivize people from learning about personal finance. It may turn them off to the idea of learning about personal finance altogether. Think about your worst subject, for example, math or English or whatever your worst subject was when you were younger. Perhaps you had a bad teacher, and so because you had this bad experience as far as learning a certain topic, you basically just never want to learn it, in the future at all. So that's kind of a good example of how if we do that same thing with personal finance, it actually has the wrong consequence of what we want. We want people to be excited about personal finance, make it their own, and benefit from it. But if we're turning, certain people off from the idea of learning about personal finance, that has the exact opposite consequence of what we're going for. But on the other hand, if we teach personal finance too late, it may have the opposite effect there as well, because people may not necessarily be as interested by the time they're, like senior in high school, for example. Perhaps they're thinking about college, they're maybe working a part-time job, and plus, on top of that, senioritis is a real thing. So realistically, the solution probably lies somewhere in the middle, perhaps, late middle school or early high school. But now there becomes this question as far as who teaches personal finance. As things currently stand, less than 20% of teachers felt qualified to teach personal finance, which makes sense when most likely those teachers were never taught personal finance either. So there ends up being this chain or kind of cycle effect, so to speak, as far as teaching personal finance. No one was taught personal finance, so now they're not, equipped to teach personal finance. But now that younger generation isn't equipped to teach personal finance either, and so forth and so forth. And here's another problem for you to consider. Some of these personal finance principles can actually be pretty technical in nature. Think about explaining why compound interest is very valuable and explaining the compound interest formula to somebody. That's something that someone's going to have to study. So, and that's just one example. So if you're going to be a personal finance teacher, it probably makes sense to take a few finance courses in college. But if you're somebody in college and you're having to take, finance courses, and you're going to take a few finance courses to be a personal finance teacher where you're probably not necessarily making that much, $35,000 to $42,000 a year, versus taking additional finance courses and becoming, a financial advisor or work in wealth management or anything like that. You can end up making, there's huge financial opportunities moving into the finance industry versus being a teacher. So you kind of have this weird incentive of how do you find qualified teachers that aren't necessarily going to go all the way into just majoring in finance altogether. And here's another question for you. Do you standardize test these personal finance principles? Because you don't necessarily want to create a scenario where you have teachers teaching personal finance in a wrong way to, certain students, because that puts them at a huge disadvantage, further down the road in their life. So you want to make sure that, everybody's teaching the same personal finance principles correctly. But on the other hand, if you do standardize tests, it then becomes more about making sure these students, pass these standardized tests and not necessarily making personal finance their own. And it may also just altogether cause students to look at personal finance as something that's, irrelevant. It's just something that's getting tested, not necessarily something that's going to be applicable in their life. And I got one more issue that has to be addressed as well, which is, do you require these personal finance courses as a required course that has to be taken before you graduate? It just seems like there's more and more courses every day, fighting for the attention of young students. You're getting required economics courses, you're getting required government courses, math, English, Spanish, language, anything. So there's so many things that are fighting for this limited amount of time that a student may have in school. And you also want to, allow students to have that freedom and creativity to explore their own interests. So it's kind of this balance, this delicate balance as far as requiring courses that may be relevant and important in life versus allowing them to kind of explore, and be creative on their own. Okay, maybe I hit some of the issues a little bit too hard, but I wanted to emphasize that teaching personal finance is actually a pretty complex issue, and it's not as simple as it may seem. Okay, now onto a couple of solutions. One solution may be to connect the dots between, teaching personal finance to individuals and comparing that to, these global economic issues that we deal with, or even just a national, economic issues that we deal with. For example, if you think about it this way, a lot of people that lack financial education and knowledge tend to end up being people in poverty, minorities, or underrepresented groups. To elaborate on my example, if you're living in a low-income household, there's a good chance that all of your financial knowledge and know-how is coming from your parents. And all of the financial, decisions they're making tend to end up being the reason that they're living in poverty in the first place, or, are in a low-income household. So all of that, bad, poor financial decisions that they're making and that knowledge is being passed on to you and kind of guarantees that you're going to make the same mistakes. And that's not necessarily to say that you can't learn from, people's bad financial decisions. You definitely can, and there's great value in that. The problem I have is when I hear people talk about why it's a great idea to buy a brand new $30,000 car because it's going to have a warranty. You don't necessarily have to stress about repairs or parts or anything like that. And that's a really great financial, decision to make. But yet this person is like, $50,000 in debt. So it's like, that's not the person you want to be taking your financial advice from. So by everybody kind of learning personal finance, on a really good basis, then it kind of evens out the playing field. You're not necessarily, destined to end up the same way that your parents may have if they ended up having poor financial decisions. The last part in all of this is to have an understanding that teaching personal finance and getting that up and running is going to be a long and, tedious process almost, because, there's nothing really in place right now as far as teaching personal finance. And on top of that, we need to establish the value as far as teaching personal finance. So if we just start with things like basic things like the difference between a debit card and a credit card, how to open up a savings account, or even how to open up a checking account. Those are really basic fundamental principles that people have to learn. And then once people start to see that there's real value in teaching personal finance at a young age, then more and more people can get on board. And then we can start to move on to more complex issues like the value of compound interest and how to invest and, insurance principles. What's the difference between a copay and a premium? Many people in their 20s and 30s don't even realize what the difference is. So those are definitely things, it's all about starting with the basics and getting people on board. I definitely think teaching personal finance, we're definitely going to have to be open to solutions as far as the best way to teach it. But at the same time, I have heard some pretty creative solutions that I don't necessarily think are the right move. For example, I've heard of people, suggesting that we should leverage the, financial advisor community. They're already teaching adults about personal finance. Why not kind of, have schools hire, financial advisors to come in every now and then to teach personal finance to students? To me, I just think that's kind of a slippery slope. I just kind of imagine a scenario where American Express is coming into, a student filled with 5th graders or 4th graders talking about why everybody should have a credit card and why it's the most valuable thing. So I kind of, don't necessarily think we should be in a position where the incentives aren't necessarily aligned too well. But I will say that as far as teaching personal finance, it is going to be a matter of trial and error. I fully anticipate that there's going to be things as far as teaching personal finance that aren't going to necessarily work out too well. And it's going to be a big mistake. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should throw it out altogether. We should just stop teaching personal finance. It's about learning from those mistakes and correcting it and making it better, so that way everybody can learn personal finance, and then we have a better nation and a better world. So in the end, I hope you found this video interesting or perhaps even useful, or that at least opened you up to another perspective. That's my whole intent here, is just to open people up to different perspectives and think about things that they may not have thought about before. So if you like those types of videos, or if you like personal finance, business, economics, or anything like that, please hit that subscribe button so you can stay tuned for more. And if you appreciate this video at all, please give it a big thumbs up. I'd appreciate it a lot. It'd mean a lot to me, and I hope to see you in the next one.